You didn't lose because you were wrong. You lost because you responded. Think about the last time it happened. Someone said something stupid, something unfair, something that had no business being directed at you. And before your brain could catch up with your mouth, you were already in it. Already explaining. Already defending. Already handing them exactly what they needed to feel powerful. And the worst part, the part that kept you up that night, wasn't what they said. It was what you did. Because somewhere in the wreckage of that conversation, you felt it. That sick, quiet feeling that you had just made yourself smaller. Not because they were smarter, not because they were right, but because they baited you, and you bit. Hard. Psychologists call what happened to you in that moment an ego threat response. Your identity felt attacked, and your nervous system did what it was wired to do. It fired back. Automatic. Unthinking. Exactly like they knew it would. Because here is what nobody tells you about the people who provoke you. They are almost never doing it randomly. Stupid people are not stupid about everything. They are remarkably, almost professionally skilled at finding the one nerve in a sharp man that makes him forget he is sharp. There is a specific category of man that you have encountered, maybe once, maybe a handful of times, and he unsettled you in a way you couldn't immediately explain. Someone challenged him, provoked him, said something that should have drawn blood, and he just looked at them, not with anger, not with the strained composure of a man barely holding himself back, with something colder, something that felt almost surgical. He didn't respond, not because he had nothing to say, but because responding was so far beneath what he was operating at that the thought never even arrived. The fools said their piece, and he just continued. Like the interruption had never happened, like the person had never existed. And somehow, without raising his voice, without winning a single argument, he walked out of that room owning it. That man has something you haven't been taught to recognize yet. Machiavelli spent his entire life studying men like him. What he found was not a personality trait. It was not a gift. It was a specific, learnable structure of behavior that the moment you see it clearly, you will never be able to unsee. And you will also never be able to unfeel the number of times you walked into a room with it available to you and chose the other thing instead. The title of this video says something most men read wrong. Never respond again. The first instinct, especially for a sharp man, is resistance. It sounds like surrender. It sounds like the advice a therapist gives someone who can't handle conflict. Swallow it. Walk away. Be the bigger person. And if that's what this was, you'd already be gone. Because you've heard that before. You've tried that before. And it never felt like strength. It felt like suppression. Like holding a wound closed with your bare hands and calling it healing. That is not what this is. When Machiavelli wrote about the behavior of effective rulers, men who held power not for months but for decades, he noticed something that contradicted everything the philosophers around him were teaching. The men who lasted were not the ones who could out-argue their enemies. The men who lasted were the ones whose opponents could never quite get a read on them, never quite provoke them into a visible reaction, never quite find the edge that, once pushed, would reveal what they were really made of. Silence. Strategic, deliberate, constructed silence was not their weakness. It was their most dangerous weapon. So when this video says, never respond again, understand what that actually means. It does not mean become passive. It does not mean let the world walk over you while you quietly suffer. It means something that will take the rest of this video to fully build. But here is the foundation of it. Every time you respond to someone beneath you, you are not just wasting a moment. You are making a declaration. You are announcing to every person in that room, in that conversation, in that exchange, exactly where your boundaries are, exactly what unsettles you, exactly which buttons exist, and precisely where they are located. You are handing a map of your vulnerabilities to people who have already demonstrated they will use it against you. And here is what most men never consider. The fool who provoked you will forget the exchange by tomorrow. But everyone else who witnessed it won't. They filed it. Quietly, without you noticing. Because what you revealed in that moment wasn't just frustration. It was the blueprint of exactly how to move you. And in the wrong hands, that blueprint doesn't get used once. It gets used every time. Now let's talk about why you keep handing it out, and why that is not an accident. Here is what nobody has told you about the urge to respond. It was never yours to begin with. From the moment you were old enough to be evaluated, you were trained. Not with lessons, not with lectures, with rewards. Every time you raised your hand and gave the right answer, you were praised. Every time you defended yourself and won, you were respected. Every time you corrected someone and were proven right, something in your brain released a small, precise dose of dopamine. The same neurochemical that drives hunger, desire, addiction. Your nervous system learned early, and it learned permanently. Engaging is how you establish your value. Responding is how you prove you exist. Silence, on the other hand, was never rewarded. Silence looked like you didn't know. Silence looked like weakness. Silence looked like losing. So you were never taught to be silent. You were systematically conditioned to be loud. And every institution that shaped you, school, sport, workplace, social media, was designed around the same core incentive. React. Perform. Prove yourself. The entire attention economy is built on harvesting your response. Every comment section, every provocation, every headline engineered to make your blood pressure rise exists because somewhere at the top of a very long chain, someone profits every single time you cannot stop yourself from engaging. Your reactivity is not a character flaw. It is a revenue stream. And the people around you learned this about you long before you did. Think about the ones who provoke you most consistently. They have run this experiment on you before. They observed the result, and they return to it because it works. Every time you responded, every time you took the bait, you were not just losing that exchange. You were training them. You have been, without knowing it, your own worst handler. Here is the actual diagnosis. You were handed a nervous system wired to perform under provocation, placed inside systems designed to trigger that performance, and surrounded by people, some conscious of it, some not, who benefit every single time that wire gets pulled. The institutions were not neutral, and nobody, at any point in your formation, had any incentive to tell you that the most powerful thing a man can do when provoked is absolutely nothing. And a man who cannot be controlled is a problem for every system that depends on his compliance. Machiavelli understood this, not as psychology, but as political mechanics. A prince who reacts to every insult is a prince whose enemies control his schedule. A man whose composure can be broken on demand is a man who can be broken on demand. The ruler who could be provoked into reacting could be provoked into wars, into bad decisions, into revealing his strategy before the moment was right. His enemies didn't need to defeat him. They just needed to agitate him enough that he defeated himself. You have been defeating yourself consistently, in rooms full of people watching. And the mechanism that keeps making you do it is still running right now. Which means, before you can ever stop responding to fools, you need to understand what you are actually up against when you try. Everything you have been told about stupid people is designed to make you focus in the wrong direction. The videos, the articles, the conversations, they all frame it the same way. Difficult people, toxic people, draining people. The language always positions the fool as the active force and you as the passive recipient. They drain you. They exhaust you. They get under your skin, as if you are simply a victim of their existence, as if the transaction is something that happens to you rather than something you actively, repeatedly, voluntarily participate in. This framing is comfortable. It is also the reason you keep losing, because here is the thing. Nobody in this conversation ever says directly, stupid people do not have the ability to drain a man who has decided not to engage. They have no mechanism for it. A fool's power over you is not inherent to them. It is borrowed, and you are the one lending it. Think about what actually happens in the moment of provocation. Someone says something beneath you, and in the space between that moment and your response, a space that exists, however briefly, a decision gets made. Your brain runs one calculation. Is my identity threatened enough to defend right now? The answer almost always comes back. Yes. And the moment you act on it, you have transferred something irreversible. You have taken their chaos and made it yours. You have stepped inside their reality and agreed to fight on their terrain. And their terrain is always going to favor them, because chaos is their native environment, and precision is yours. You just left precision behind. This is what psychologists who study cognitive load have documented with uncomfortable clarity. When you engage with a highly irrational person, your brain does not operate on their level. It attempts to translate their level while simultaneously maintaining your own. You are running two operating systems at once. You are trying to track their logic, predict their next move, suppress your own frustration, choose your words carefully, and maintain your composure, all simultaneously. They are doing none of that. They are simply feeling an emotion and expressing it. The cognitive gap between what you are expending and what they are expending in that exchange is enormous. They are throwing rocks. You are performing surgery. And you are doing it while someone throws rocks at you. No surgeon operates well under those conditions. No surgeon should have to. The Dunning-Kruger effect. It is not just that incompetent people don't know what they don't know. It is that their confidence, their absolute unearned certainty, functions as a kind of psychological armor that your logic literally cannot penetrate. When you bring evidence to a fool, you are not illuminating them. You are threatening them. And a threatened ego does not open. It hardens. It doubles down. It gets louder. You have seen this happen in real time. You brought the facts. They got more confident. You brought more facts. They got more aggressive. You walked away feeling like you were losing your mind. You weren't losing your mind. You were experiencing the predictable outcome of a process that was never going to end any other way. The armor was always going to hold, because it was never made of logic to begin with, and logic is the only tool you brought. Here is the reframe that changes everything. The fool did not defeat you. The fool never had that capacity. What defeated you was the part of you that still believed, despite all evidence, that this time would be different. That this time, if you just explained it clearly enough, they would see it. That belief, that stubborn, quietly arrogant belief, that you can reason someone out of a position they didn't reason themselves into. That is the trap, and it is entirely yours. You built it. You maintain it. You walk back into it every single time. Not because you are weak, but because you are intelligent enough to know what the right answer is, and not yet disciplined enough to accept that knowing the right answer is completely irrelevant when the other person's mind is constitutionally incapable of receiving it. Machiavelli observed something about this that cuts deeper than strategy. He noted that the most dangerous enemy a capable man faces is rarely his equal. It is almost always someone so far beneath him that he never bothered to develop a defense. Because who prepares for an attack from below? You build walls facing outward, facing rivals, facing competition, facing people who match your level. You leave the floor completely unguarded, and that is precisely where the fool comes from. Not through the front gate, through the gap you never thought to protect, because you never thought anyone that small could do any real damage. They can. Not because they are powerful, because you are unguarded. And an unguarded man, no matter how sharp, is just a man standing in an open field. You are not losing to stupid people. You are losing to the version of yourself that refuses to let them be wrong in peace. And that version of you, reactive, performance-driven, conditioned to prove, is going to keep costing you. In rooms that matter, in moments that don't get replayed, in the slow, invisible accumulation of a reputation built not on your best moves, but on your worst reactions. The question is no longer whether you understand the trap. You do. The question is what you are actually made of when the wire gets pulled and everything in your nervous system is screaming to respond. And you have to choose, in that precise moment, to do something your entire conditioning is fighting against. That choice has a name, and it is the rarest thing most men will never develop. Every man who has ever read Machiavelli has made the same mistake. They read him as a manual for cruelty. They miss the point entirely. Because Machiavelli was not writing about cruelty, he was writing about clarity. The Prince is not a book about how to be vicious. It is a book about how to see, how to strip away every comfortable illusion about human nature, and look at the machinery underneath with cold, unblinking precision. And when you read him that way, one observation rises above everything else. One insight that runs beneath every chapter like a current. The man who can be read, whose reactions are visible, whose triggers are known, whose emotional state is legible to the room. That man will always be managed by someone else. Always. Regardless of his intelligence, regardless of his position, regardless of how right he is. Visibility is vulnerability. That is the core of it. Not weakness, not ignorance. Visibility. The moment another person can accurately predict how you will respond to a provocation, they own a piece of your behavior. And a person who owns a piece of your behavior does not need to defeat you. They just need to operate that piece at the right moment. What Machiavelli was describing, without naming it, is what social psychologists would come to call frame. And this is the word this entire video has been building toward. Not patience, not discipline, not emotional regulation. Frame. It is the invisible psychological reality that a man projects so completely, so consistently, that the people around him are pulled into it, rather than him being pulled into theirs. It is the difference between a man who enters a room and adjusts to its energy, and a man who enters a room and the room adjusts to his. It is not charisma. Charisma is performed. Frame is foundational. It does not require you to say anything. It does not require you to do anything. It is simply the weight of a man who has decided, at some foundational level, that his reality does not bend to accommodate the chaos of lesser minds. And that decision, that deep, quiet, immovable decision, is what radiates outward and makes other people feel, without being able to explain why, that provoking this man would be a mistake. Think about the men in history who held power longest. Not the ones who seized it loudest, but the ones who kept it quietly across decades of shifting circumstances. They shared one characteristic that had nothing to do with intelligence or ruthlessness or charisma. They were phenomenally difficult to read. Elizabeth I kept every court in Europe destabilized for 40 years, not through military dominance, but through deliberate, masterful ambiguity. Nobody could predict her. Nobody could get a firm read on her intentions, her allegiances, her emotional state. That uncertainty was her weapon. Cardinal Richelieu. The man who effectively ran France from the shadows for nearly 2 decades was described by his contemporaries as a man who seemed to have no face, not because he lacked personality, because he had developed the discipline to reveal nothing that he had not chosen to reveal. These were not cold people. They were precise people. There is a difference. Coldness is an absence. Precision is a choice. And here is where it becomes personal. Every time you respond to a provocation, you are not just reacting in that moment. You are updating someone's model of you. You are adding data to the picture they are quietly building. The picture that tells them exactly how to handle you, exactly how to move you, exactly how much pressure to apply and where. The people around you are forming associations about your triggers, whether they intend to or not, and every response you give accelerates that process. The rare man has understood that his reactions are not just emotional events. They are information. They are currency. And like any currency, the value is determined by scarcity. A man who reacts to everything makes his reactions worthless. They tell you nothing specific because they tell you everything constantly. But a man whose composure holds across situations that would visibly move other men. When that man finally responds, the room stops, because his response carries the accumulated weight of every time he chose not to. His silence has been building interest, and when he finally speaks, it lands with a force that no amount of constant reaction could ever manufacture. That is frame. Not a technique, not a mood, a structure, one that takes longer to build than anything else this video will discuss, and one that begins with understanding exactly what it costs you every single day that you don't have it. You came here for validation. Some part of you wanted to be told that you are the smart one, that the people around you are beneath you, that your frustration is justified. And it is. But justification was never going to change anything. You have been justified for years. You are still reactive. You are still handing the map over. You are still walking out of rooms that you should have owned, quietly furious at yourself for reasons you couldn't fully articulate. This is the part where most videos give you a list. 5 habits of emotionally intelligent people. 3 things Stoics do differently. Some repackaged Marcus Aurelius that sounds profound for 48 hours and then dissolves back into the same patterns you have always had. That is not what this is. What comes next is the actual mechanics. Not of how to feel more composed, but of how to become the kind of man that provocation can no longer find purchase in. Not as a mood, not as a practice, as a permanent structural shift in how you move through the world. It is going to be specific. It is going to be uncomfortable. What it is going to ask you to give up is the one thing you have been using as a weapon your entire life, and have never once considered might also be your greatest liability. The weapon is your intelligence. More precisely, your need to be seen using it, not your intelligence itself. That is not the liability. The liability is the compulsion attached to it, the need to demonstrate it, to deploy it visibly, to make sure the room knows it is there. That compulsion, that quiet, constant hunger to be recognized as the sharpest mind present, is the single most exploitable thing about you. And it has been exploited. Consistently. By people who couldn't define half the words you used against them, because they didn't need to match your intelligence. They just needed to trigger your need to display it. And the moment you displayed it, the moment you opened your mouth to correct, to argue, to prove, you handed them exactly what they needed to keep you occupied while they moved freely. Frame is not the absence of intelligence. It is the absence of the need to prove it. It is the transition from a man who uses his mind as a performance to a man who uses his mind as an instrument. A performance requires an audience. An instrument requires only a result. The man with frame has made that transition completely. He is not managing his ego in the moment of provocation. He has simply outgrown the part of himself that needed the provocation to mean something. When someone challenges him, there is no internal negotiation, no suppressed impulse, no white-knuckled restraint. The challenge arrives and passes like weather. He watches it move through the room, and his only thought, if he has one at all, is clinical, observational. What does this person's need to provoke me? Tell me about them. Not about me, about them. That shift, from self-referential to purely observational, is the core of what frame actually feels like from the inside. And it is not a feeling most men have ever experienced for longer than a few minutes in their best moments, because sustaining it requires something that goes against every instinct that was built into you. It requires the complete and total surrender of the need for external validation, not the management of that need, not the suppression of it, the surrender of it. The moment you stop needing the room to confirm your value, the room loses all leverage over you. A man who does not need your approval cannot be manipulated through the withholding of it. A man who does not need to be seen as right cannot be baited through the challenging of it. He becomes, in the most literal sense, ungovernable by the tools that govern almost everyone else. Machiavelli watched princes destroy themselves, not through bad strategy, but through good ego. They were right. They knew they were right. They needed everyone else to know they were right. And that need, That very human, very understandable need was the crack that their enemies pried open every single time. And he has understood, at a level most men never reach, that the outcome and the acknowledgement are almost never available simultaneously. You can have the win, or you can have the credit. The man with frame takes the win, every time, quietly, and lets someone else take the credit, because credit is a consolation prize for people who confuse the performance for the point. Think about what this looks like in the interactions you are having right now. The colleague who undermines you in the meeting, the person who publicly challenges your competence, the fool who says something so wrong, so confidently, that every cell in your body wants to correct them. The man without frame enters all three of those scenarios the same way, visibly, audibly. His reaction confirms the threat was real. His response hands over the map. His need to be seen winning the exchange costs him the war. The man with frame enters those same scenarios as an observer. He watches. He files. He says less than the room expects. And in the silence where his reaction should have been, something interesting happens. The other person, the provocateur, the underminer, the fool, becomes uncomfortable, because they prepared for resistance and found none, because they threw the stone and the wall didn't move, and a person who prepared for a fight and finds only stillness doesn't feel victorious. They feel exposed. They feel, without being able to name it, that they have just revealed something about themselves to a man who revealed nothing in return. And it requires not a single word. This is the rare quality the title of this video is pointing at. Not silence as a tactic, not composure as a practice. Frame as a permanent condition of a man who has stopped being available to the provocations, opinions, and chaos of people operating beneath his level. Not above them in any arrogant sense. Simply unavailable, unreachable. The stone thrown finds no surface to damage because the wall has stopped registering stones as threats. Most men will read that and feel the pull of it. They will want it the way you want something you've never had, but instantly recognize as essential. And then the wire will get pulled again. In an hour, tomorrow, next week. And they will respond. Because wanting frame and having frame are separated by exactly one thing. And that one thing is what the next part of this video is going to show you. Not as inspiration, but as mechanics. Cold, specific, and immediately applicable. There is a version of you that exists 10 years from now, and the only question that matters about him is this: did he figure this out, or didn't he? Because the cost of never developing frame is not dramatic. It does not arrive as a single catastrophic moment you can point to and say, there, that is where it went wrong. It arrives quietly, incrementally, in the accumulation of 10,000 small moments where the wire got pulled and you responded and something imperceptible shifted. A room's perception of you, a person's assessment of your composure, your own relationship with your self-respect, none of it visible in any single exchange, all of it devastating across a decade. Think about what that accumulation looks like in practice. The man who is 35 and cannot understand why he is not further along, not because he lacks intelligence, not because he lacks capability, but because somewhere in his reputation, in the minds of the people who make decisions about him, he is filed under a specific category. Reactive, emotional, difficult to read in the wrong direction. Not because he is mysterious, but because nobody can predict when he will lose composure next. He has confused being vocal with being powerful. He has confused winning arguments with winning outcomes. And the people above him, the ones making the quiet decisions about who gets trusted with more, have been watching, not his arguments, his reactions, and they have concluded, without ever saying it to his face, that this is a man whose judgment cannot be fully trusted under pressure, because they have seen what pressure does to him. He showed them, repeatedly, for free, the promotion that went to someone less qualified but more composed. The opportunity that was offered to someone else in the room, because the person offering it needed to know it would be handled without drama. The relationship that slowly recalibrated around his volatility until the people in it stopped bringing him their real problems and started managing him instead. None of these losses come with an explanation. None of them arrive as consequences he can directly trace back to a specific argument he shouldn't have entered. They are invisible. And invisible losses are the most dangerous kind, because you cannot defend against a cost you cannot see. And underneath all of it, underneath the stalled trajectory and the closed doors, there is something more personal and more damaging than any of it. There is the private knowledge, the one that arrives at 2 a.m. in the spaces between sleep, that he has been spending the most finite resource he has on the least worthy recipients imaginable. His energy, his attention, his time, the irreplaceable hours of a life being poured into circular arguments with people who were never going to change, never going to concede, never going to be worth a single minute of what he gave them. You cannot get those hours back. You cannot reclaim the mental bandwidth that was consumed by conflicts that produced nothing. You cannot undo the slow, invisible erosion of a sharp mind that has been spending itself on blunt objects for years. That is the cost. Not a moment. A life, lived slightly below its own potential in every direction, for no reason more significant than the inability to let a fool be wrong in peace. The man who never develops frame does not lose everything at once. He just never quite arrives. And at some point, later than it should have been, quieter than it deserved, he understands that the thing which held him back was never the fool's. It was the part of him that could not walk away from them. That part has a name too, and dismantling it is going to require you to do something that will feel, at first, almost physically wrong. What you are about to learn is not a mindset. It is not a philosophy. It is a sequence. A cold, precise, repeatable sequence that the man with frame runs. Not consciously, not effortfully, but as the automatic output of something he rebuilt in himself at the deepest level. And the reason it feels almost physically wrong the first time you try it is not because it is difficult. It is because it requires you to interrupt a process that your entire nervous system has been running on autopilot for decades. You are not learning something new. You are stopping something old. And stopping something that has been running that long feels, in the body, like a kind of death. It is not. It is the opposite of that. The first element is the pause. Not the pause as a breathing exercise. Not the pause as a composure technique you read about in a productivity article. The pause as a deliberate act of reclamation. Here is what the pause actually is. 1. Automatically, you have established that the calculation exists, that the brain asks, is my identity threatened enough to defend right now? The pause is the moment you step in front of that question and replace it with a different one. Not, how do I respond to this? But, what does responding to this cost? That single substitution, practiced until it becomes reflex, changes everything downstream. Because the moment you are asking what it costs, rather than how to counter it, you are no longer inside the provocation. You are above it, looking down at it, deciding. From a position of genuine choice rather than conditioned reflex, whether it deserves a single calorie of your energy. Almost always, it doesn't. And you will know that, clearly. The moment you ask the right question, the answer arrives without effort. Because the honest answer, in almost every provocation you will ever face from someone operating beneath your level, is the same. This costs me more than it is worth. And that recognition, clean, immediate, and completely unemotional, is the beginning of frame as a lived experience rather than an aspiration. You already know what this feels like. There have been moments, rare ones, but they existed, where something was said to you and you felt the pull and then something quieter overrode it. You said nothing. You walked away. And hours later, without being able to explain why, you felt more like yourself than you did on any of the days you fought back and won. That was not weakness. That was the first time frame moved through you. You did not have a name for it. You did not know how to repeat it. This is how you repeat it. The second element is what replaces the response. Because silence without intention is just suppression. And suppression, as established, breaks. What replaces the response is observation. Pure, clinical, almost anthropological observation. When the provocation arrives and you do not respond, shift your entire internal orientation from participant to observer. You are no longer in the exchange. You are watching the exchange. And from that position, you can see the ego defending itself. You can see the insecurity driving the provocation, not out of cruelty, out of accuracy. You are simply seeing the situation as it actually is, rather than as your nervous system was framing it. This observational shift does something else that most men never anticipate. It changes your face, your body, the physical signals you are broadcasting into the room. A man who is suppressing a reaction looks tense. His jaw is set. His stillness is effortful, and the effort is visible. A man who is genuinely observing rather than suppressing looks different. He looks. And this is the word people consistently use when they describe men with strong frame. Settled. Not checked out. Not passive. Settled. Like a man who has already assessed the situation and found it beneath the threshold that requires his full engagement. That quality, that visible settledness, is itself a form of communication. It tells the room something about you without a single word. It tells them that whatever was just thrown at you did not land where they expected. And that uncertainty, that slight, unspoken confusion about why you didn't react, is more powerful than any response you could have given. The third element is the redirect. Not always necessary, but essential to understand. There will be situations, professional, social, unavoidable, where complete silence reads as absence rather than frame, where the dynamic requires some form of response to maintain function. In those moments, the man with frame does not engage with the content of the provocation. He redirects to the outcome. Someone challenges your competence in a meeting. The reactive man defends his competence. The man with frame acknowledges the comment with the minimum possible surface area. A single sentence, flat in affect, that moves the room toward the objective without validating the provocation as worthy of real engagement. Something like, noted, here is where we are going, and then he goes there, without looking back, without checking whether the provocateur feels satisfied, without needing the room to have witnessed him win, because he already knows something the room is still figuring out. That the man who moved the outcome forward while the other man was still performing is the man who just won. Quietly. Completely. In a way that cannot be argued with, because it was never argued at all. These three elements, the pause, the observation, the redirect, are not techniques to be applied situationally. They are a new operating sequence to be installed permanently, and the installation is not comfortable. The first time you hold the pause while every nerve in your body is screaming to respond, it will feel like holding your hand in cold water. The first time you observe instead of engage, part of you will feel like a coward. That feeling is the old wiring misfiring. It is the conditioned, self-mistaking restraint for weakness, because restraint was never rewarded, and weakness was never tolerated, and your nervous system cannot yet tell the difference between the two. It will learn. Every time you hold the pause and watch the outcome improve, the association recalibrates. Every time you redirect instead of defend and walk away with the objective intact, something shifts. Not dramatically, quietly. The way all permanent things are built. Not in moments of inspiration, but in the unremarkable accumulation of correct decisions made when it would have been easier to make the wrong one. The man with frame was not born with it, he built it. In exactly the moments you are dreading right now. And on the other side of that construction is not a better version of you. It is the first accurate version of you, the one that was always there, buried under a decade of conditioning that taught you to perform instead of prevail. There is a man you have encountered in your life, in a boardroom, at a table, in a room where power was being negotiated quietly, and you felt it before you could name it. Something about the way he occupied space, the way the room adjusted slightly when he entered, the way conflict seemed to slide off him without leaving a mark. You watched someone try to provoke him once, maybe, and you watched him do something that stayed with you long after the room emptied. Nothing. He did nothing. And somehow that nothing was the most commanding thing anyone did all day. You had been trying to understand that man ever since. Not consciously, but in every moment of frustration after a conversation you wished you had handled differently. In every argument you won that still felt like a loss. In every room you left slightly smaller than you entered it. You have been reaching, without knowing it, for what he had, for what this video has spent the last 30 minutes constructing. And now you know what it is. Frame. The permanent, structural condition of a man whose reality does not bend to accommodate the provocations of people operating beneath his level. Not a mood, not a method, a condition. Something that once genuinely built cannot be taken from you by anyone who was never capable of giving it to you in the first place. Here is what that man looks like in practice. Not in the dramatic moments. In the ordinary ones. He moves through his day, and the friction that derails other men simply does not accumulate in him. The comment that would have occupied your thoughts for 3 hours passes through him in 3 seconds. The provocation that would have pulled you into a 20-minute exchange gets nothing from him. Not a sigh, not a visible reset, not the slight tightening around the eyes that tells a room a man has been touched. He receives it. He files it. He continues, and the people around him, the ones who study him, the way people study things. Guilt does not move him. Provocation does not move him. The withholding of approval does not move him. And a man who cannot be moved by the standard instruments of social control is a man nobody quite knows how to handle, which means he is a man nobody can stop. There is a distinction that separates every man who has ever held real power from every man who only appeared to hold it. One man's stability was built on conditions, on being agreed with, on being respected, on the room behaving the way he needed it to behave. The other man's stability was built on himself, on something interior and immovable that external conditions could pressure but never reach. That is the only distinction that has ever mattered. And it is the only one that cannot be taken from you once you have genuinely built it. This is the destination. Not a man who never feels the pull. A man for whom the pull no longer matters. A man who has become, in the most precise and practical sense of the word, too expensive to provoke. The fools will run their calculations. They always do. And they will find that the return on provoking you no longer justifies the attempt. Not because you have become intimidating, because you have become unreachable. And unreachable men do not get played. They do not get managed. They do not get steered by the cheap instruments that steer almost everyone else. They simply continue forward, at a pace and in a direction that nobody who ever tried to slow them down could follow. The fools are not going anywhere. The provocations are not going to stop. The world is not going to become reasonable because you have decided to see it clearly. But you are going to move through it differently now. Not loudly, not dramatically, the way the most dangerous men have always moved through it. With your hand never shown, your frame never broken, and your direction never altered by someone who was never going to arrive where you were going anyway. Go build it, quietly, and let them wonder why you stopped responding.